You know what really used to eat at me in the shop? I'd be halfway through a project, maybe restoring a piece of old furniture or finishing up a workbench, and I'd find damaged wood, a gouge in a plank I couldn't replace, a cracked rail that was too far along to start over, a tool handle that had gone loose and just would not stay tight no matter how many times I shimmed it. I'd end up scrapping good material or settling for a sloppy fix that never really held. Then about 10 years ago, I started studying how the old shipwrights worked, the carpenters who sailed on wooden ships during the age of sail. These men had to make perfect, lasting repairs in the middle of the ocean with no lumberyard, no hardware store, and no second chances. And what I found completely changed how I approach repairs in my own shop. Today, I'm going to walk you through 9 of their most brilliant repair methods, techniques that are simple, clever, and just as useful in your garage as they were on a ship 300 years ago. Plus, stick around to the end because I've got a bonus tip involving a marking technique that makes one of these repairs almost foolproof. Let's get into it. What we're looking at today are real working methods from traditional wooden shipbuilding. These aren't decorative tricks or museum pieces. They're battle-tested solutions that kept ships afloat and crews alive. And the beautiful thing is, nearly every one of them translates directly to the kind of repair work you and I run into on furniture, timber frames, workbenches, and old houses. Once you see the thinking behind them, you'll never look at a piece of damaged wood the same way again. So let me start with where these methods come from and why they deserve your attention. The shipwrights I'm talking about were mostly working from the 1600s through the 1800s, the golden age of wooden shipbuilding, in the Royal Navy, in merchant fleets, in fishing vessels up and down the Atlantic coast. These were tradesmen, not artists. They served formal apprenticeships that lasted 7 years. And by the time they were done, they could take apart and rebuild nearly every piece of a wooden ship using hand tools. What made their skills remarkable wasn't just the quality of the work, it was the conditions they worked under. Imagine you're the ship's carpenter on a frigate somewhere in the South Pacific. A storm has cracked one of your spars, a section of hull planking has been damaged, you've got white oak, maybe some elm, whatever timber you're carrying in the hold. You've got your tool chest. And that's it. No running to the store, no ordering a replacement. You fix it right, or people die. That kind of pressure produced incredibly ingenious solutions. These men developed a philosophy I'd sum up as this: never remove more than you have to, never waste material you can't replace, and make every repair at least as strong as what was there before. That thinking shaped every technique I'm about to show you. And honestly, it's the best repair philosophy I've ever come across for any kind of woodworking. The first method is called a graving piece, and it's one of the most elegant repairs in all of woodworking. Let's say you've got a plank with localized damage, a deep gouge, a rotten spot, a section where the wood has been crushed or torn. Your instinct might be to replace the whole plank. The shipwrights couldn't afford to think that way. Instead, they would cut out only the damaged area and inlay a precisely fitted patch. Here's how it works. You take a chisel and a straight edge, and you define the boundaries of the damage. Then you cut a clean, shallow recess with slightly angled sides, usually about 2 to 3 degrees of undercut on each edge. The shape is typically a parallelogram or a diamond, never a rectangle with square corners, because sharp inside corners create stress points that can crack. Then you take a matching piece of the same species, ideally the same board if you have offcuts, and you fit it into that recess with the grain running the same direction. The angled sides create a slight dovetail effect that locks the patch in place, even before any adhesive. When it's done well and flushed off with a hand plane, you can barely see it. I used this on an old white oak tabletop that had a deep burn mark, and the repair practically disappeared. It's the kind of fix that makes you feel like you actually outsmarted the damage. The second method is the one that really made me sit up and pay attention. It's called a splayed scarf joint, and the shipwrights used it to splice a new section of wood into a broken spar or structural timber. Think about that for a second. A spar on a sailing ship, the mast or boom or yard, is under enormous bending and compression loads, and these men could cut one apart and put it back together strong enough to survive a gale. The splayed scarf works like this. You cut matching tapered faces on the two pieces you want to join, with a slope ratio of about 1 to 12. That means for every 1 inch of thickness, you need 12 inches of scarf length. On a 3-inch diameter spar, that's a scarf about 36 inches long. The mating faces are flat and smooth. And here's the key. They added a slight step or lip at the center of the joint called a nib. That nib prevents the two halves from sliding apart under tension. The whole assembly gets drawn together with iron bolts or wooden tree nails, and then seized with rope, or later banded with iron hoops. The genius is in the geometry. That long taper distributes the stress over a huge glue surface area, and the nib gives it mechanical lock. I've used a simplified version of this to repair a cracked hickory handle on a fro, and the joint is actually stronger than the original wood around it. If you've ever had to splice a broken piece and thought there was no way to get it strong again, this is your answer. The third method is one I wish somebody had told me about 30 years ago. It's the hot linseed oil soak for tightening a loose tool handle. We've all dealt with this. You're using a chisel or a hammer, and the head starts wobbling on the handle. Most of us shim it with a little wedge or wrap it with tape, or just live with it until we finally replace the handle. The old shipwrights had a better way. They'd heat raw linseed oil until it was just below smoking, around 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and then soak the loose joint, the area where the handle meets the head, in that hot oil for about 15 to 20 minutes. Here's what happens. The heat opens up the wood fibers and drives the oil deep into the cellular structure. As the wood cools, the fibers swell permanently, and the oil polymerizes inside them, locking that expansion in place. It's not a temporary fix. The handle gets tighter than it was when it was new, and it stays that way because the cured linseed oil acts like a resin inside the wood. I tried this on a framing chisel with a white oak handle that had been loose for months. After the soak, I let it cool overnight, and that handle has not moved in over 3 years. No shim, no glue, no tape, just oil and heat and a little patience. The key is using raw linseed oil, not boiled, because the raw oil penetrates deeper before it starts to cure. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The fourth method is called a Dutchman patch, and while the name might sound familiar to some of you, the way the shipwrights used it goes well beyond what most of us think of. In shipyard work, a Dutchman was used to repair localized rot in structural timbers, things like keelsons, frames, and deck beams, where replacing the entire timber was impractical. The carpenter would first excavate all the rotten wood until he reached solid material. Then he'd square up the cavity into a clean rectangular pocket, usually about 1.5 to 2 inches deep. The patch itself was cut from seasoned white oak or elm, matching the grain direction, and fitted so tightly it had to be tapped in with a mallet. No gaps, no daylight around the edges. The fit was everything. In many cases, they'd coat the mating surfaces with a mixture of pine tar and tallow for moisture resistance. What I love about this is the discipline of it. You don't just slap a patch over the damage. You remove the problem completely, prepare a clean pocket, and install a piece that becomes part of the structure. I've used this on a timber frame barn post where rot had eaten into one face, and the repair is structurally sound and almost invisible under the original surface plane. The fifth method involves caulking with oakum and paying with pitch, and while it sounds like a hull-specific technique, the underlying principle is incredibly useful. Oakum is loose hemp or jute fiber that's been treated with pine tar. The shipwrights would drive it into the seams between hull planks using a caulking iron and a mallet, working it in with controlled, even blows until the fibers compressed and filled the gap. Then they'd seal over it with hot pitch, a mix of pine tar and rosin, heated to a liquid state. The oakum provides a compressible, flexible gasket that moves with the wood as it swells and shrinks. The pitch seals out water. Together, they create a joint that breathes with the seasons, but never leaks. Now, you're probably not caulking a hull in your shop, but the principle of a flexible, sealed joint is something I've applied to outdoor furniture, garden structures, and even large workbench tops, where seasonal movement would otherwise open up visible gaps. Using cotton rope and a good exterior sealant, you can achieve the same effect. The old shipwrights understood that wood moves, and instead of fighting it, they designed a system that accommodated it. That lesson alone is worth more than half the modern woodworking advice I've read. The sixth method is wedged through tenon tightening, and it's a technique for fixing a loose mortise and tenon joint without taking it apart. Over time, especially in ship construction where vibration and loading cycles are constant, even well-fitted tenons can develop play in their mortises. The shipwright solution was elegant. They'd bore a small hole, about 3/8 of an inch, through the side of the mortise and through the tenon, then drive in a tapered hardwood pin, usually locust or live oak, that pulled the joint tight as it was driven home. If the joint needed even more tightening, they'd saw a kerf into the exposed end of the tenon and drive in a small wedge that spread the tenon inside the mortise. The combination of the draw pin and the end wedge creates a joint that's actually tighter than when it was first assembled. I've used this on chairs more times than I can count. That wobbly dining chair everyone has, drill, pin, wedge, done. It takes 10 minutes and it's permanent. The seventh method is something most of us wouldn't even attempt, but the shipwrights did it routinely. They steam-bent replacement planks right on the ship. When a hull plank was damaged beyond what a graving piece could fix, they had to replace the full plank. But hull planks aren't flat. They follow complex curves along the hull. So the carpenter would set up a steam box, often just a long wooden trough with a lid and a kettle feeding steam into one end, and he'd steam the replacement plank for about 1 hour per inch of thickness. White oak was the preferred species, because it bends beautifully when steamed. Once the plank was pliable, they'd clamp it directly against the hull frames, bending it into shape as they fastened it. The key detail here is that they always overbent the plank slightly. The practical takeaway for your shop is that steam bending is far more accessible than most people think. You can build a steam box from plywood and a wallpaper steamer for less than $40. And once you can bend wood, repairs that seemed impossible, curved chair backs, bent lamination replacements, radius trim pieces, suddenly become straightforward. The eighth method is called sistering, and it's how the shipwrights reinforced a cracked rib or frame without removing it. Ship frames, the curved ribs that give the hull its shape, sometimes cracked under stress, but were too integral to pull out. The solution was to fasten a new piece of matching timber right alongside the cracked one, essentially doubling the strength at that point. They'd shape the sister piece to match the curve of the original frame, then through-bolt or tree nail the two together so they acted as one unit. The cracked frame was still there, still carrying some load, but now it had a partner sharing the work. I've used this same principle to reinforce cracked floor joists in old houses. You don't have to tear out the damaged piece. You just add a partner alongside it, bolt or lag screw them together, and the repair is stronger than the original. It's simple, it's fast, and it doesn't require any demolition. The old shipwrights knew that sometimes the smartest repair isn't replacing what's broken, it's reinforcing it. The ninth and final method is tree nail fastening, and it's one of the most underappreciated techniques in all of traditional woodworking. A tree nail, pronounced trunnel, is a wooden peg used as a fastener. The shipwrights used them for below waterline hull fastening because iron bolts would rust and eventually weaken. They'd bore a hole through the plank and into the frame, typically about 1 inch in diameter for major structural work, then drive in a tree nail made from seasoned locust or white oak. Here's the brilliant part. Once the tree nail was driven home, they'd split the inboard end with a chisel and drive in a small hardwood wedge, spreading the tree nail inside the frame like a rivet. Some yards would also wedge the outboard end after trimming it flush. The result was a fastener that would never rust, that actually got tighter as the wood swelled in water, and that could hold for 100 years or more. I use wooden pegs regularly now in my own joinery, especially for outdoor projects. They don't corrode, they look beautiful, and when properly wedged, they're remarkably strong. A 1-inch white oak tree nail has a shear strength of over 2,000 pounds. That's not a compromise. That's a superior fastener for the right application. Now, let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years. Things I used to do myself that these shipwrights handled completely differently. No judgment here. I did all of these for longer than I'd like to admit. The first pattern is reaching for replacement material before even considering a repair. Most of us see damage and immediately think about cutting out the bad piece and making a new one. The shipwrights couldn't do that, and as a result, they developed repair methods that are often faster, more material efficient, and just as strong as a full replacement. I've saved myself hundreds of dollars in lumber since I started thinking repair first. The second pattern is using rigid fillers like epoxy or wood putty for everything. Those have their place, but the shipwrights understood that wood moves. Their repairs, whether oakum caulking or fitted graving pieces, were designed to move with the wood. Rigid fillers crack and pop out. Properly fitted wood patches and flexible sealants stay put for decades. The third pattern is over-relying on metal fasteners. Screws and bolts are convenient, but they rust, they split wood, and they create stress points. The shipwrights use tree nails and wedged joints that actually improve with age. I'm not saying throw out your screws. I'm saying there are situations where a wooden fastener is genuinely the better choice. The fourth pattern is avoiding steam bending because it seems complicated. It's not. The old shipwrights did it with a kettle and a wooden box. Once you realize how simple the setup is, a whole category of repairs opens up that you never thought you could do. The good news is, Once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. You don't have to overhaul your whole shop. Just next time you see a damaged piece, ask yourself what a shipwright would do before you reach for new lumber. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a layout technique I picked up from studying old shipyard manuals, and I've never seen it in a modern woodworking book. When the shipwrights were fitting a graving piece, they didn't try to measure the recess and then cut the patch to match. Instead, they'd cut the patch first, slightly oversized, with the angled sides already established. Then they'd hold the patch directly over the damaged area and scribe around it with a marking knife. That scribed line became the exact boundary for the recess. They cut to the line, and the patch dropped right in. It sounds obvious when you say it, but most of us do it backwards. We cut the hole first, and then try to make a piece fit it. Cutting the patch first and scribing from it guarantees a perfect fit every time, because you're using the actual piece as its own template. I started doing this about 5 years ago, and my graving pieces went from decent to nearly invisible. The joint line on the last one I did, a white oak patch on a tabletop, was so tight you needed a magnifying glass to find it. Try it once, and you'll never go back to the old way. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 16 chapters of techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what Secrets of the Shipyard is. It is my collection of Viking and naval carpentry secrets from the world's greatest traditional shipwrights, all in one place, with 25 hand-drawn illustrations and 150 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time.